The high desert wind was the first thing to greet Clara Hollowell. It pulled at the loose pins in her hair and tasted of alkali and something dead. When she stepped down from the coach, the dust of Grit Creek settled onto the black crepe of her dress, a dress she had worn for 2 months. It was the only dress she had left worth the name. She gripped the handle of her single valise, her knuckles white. The town was little more than a dozen graying buildings huddled along a rutted track, bracing themselves against the empty, endless plains of New Mexico territory. Men stopped their work, one hammering at the smithy, another leaning in the saloon doorway, and watched her. Their eyes were hard and assessing. They knew who she was. Clara kept her chin high, though she felt the heat rising in her neck. She was Arthur Hollowell's widow. Arthur, who had charmed her with promises of silver and San Francisco, and who had instead dragged her to this desolate outpost, only to lose every cent they had, and cents they did not have, at the faro table. He had put a pistol in his mouth 3 weeks prior, leaving Clara with nothing but his name, his debts, and the heavy, sour smell of his reputation. As she walked toward the mercantile, the whispers followed her, carried on the same wind that pushed dust into her eyes. "That's her, Hollowell's woman. Bad luck," a woman muttered to another, pulling her child closer as Clara passed. "Follows her like a shadow." Clara entered the mercantile, the bell above the door sounding a small, tinny alarm of her arrival. The storekeeper, Mr. Hames, looked up from his ledger. His face, normally pleasant, tightened. "Mrs. Hollowell," he said, his voice flat. He did not ask how she was. "Mr. Hames, I have this. It was my mother's." She placed a small, silver locket on the counter. The wood was worn smooth, but the counter was clean. "It is worth something. I just need supplies, enough to get to Santa Fe." He looked at the locket, then back at her. He pushed it gently back across the counter. "I cannot. Clara, Arthur's marker is too deep. The men he owed, they already came by. They said anything of his is theirs, and they count you as his." The polite refusal was worse than a shout. It meant she was nothing. She was property, and the property was in debt. Her vision blurred, not with tears, she had none left, but with a sudden, dizzying wave of hopelessness. She had nowhere to go. She could not stay in the boarding house. Her credit was gone. She could not leave. "Please," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the dry air. "I cannot." A shadow fell across the counter. A man had entered behind her, so quiet she had not heard the bell. "I will take it," a low voice said. Clara turned. The man was tall, built of solid, hard lines. He wore range clothes, stained with sweat and dirt, but it was his face that held her. Half of it was marked by a puckered, white scar that ran from his temple down his cheek, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent, grim set. His eyes, though, were clear and steady. He looked at Mr. Hames, not at her. "And her debt," the man said. "Put it on my account." Mr. Hames stared. "Luke, that is a fool's move. You know what they say about her." "I know," the man named Luke said. He placed a few coins on the counter. Enough for the locket, then looked at Clara. His gaze was not kind, nor was it unkind. It was practical, like a man assessing a livestock. "You have nowhere to be," he stated. It was not a question. Clara shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. He nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. He picked up her valise, which looked small and useless in his large hand, and walked out. He did not look back to see if she was following. She stood frozen for a beat, the locket still on the counter. "Mr. Hames sighed, pushing it toward her again. "Take it, child. He paid for it. Luke Sterling is a quiet man, but he is not a soft one. You best not keep him waiting." Clara grabbed the locket and hurried out. The wind hit her again. Luke Sterling was already untying a big mule from the hitching post, loading her valise into the basket of a supply wagon. He turned to her. The wind whipped her skirts against her legs. "My name is Luke Sterling," he said, his voice rough, as if unused. "I own the tattered S ranch. Or I will. The law states I need to be married to claim my late brother's deed. It needs a wife's name on the paper by the end of the month." Clara stared at him. The scar tissue on his face whitened as he worked his jaw. "I need a wife," he said, blunt as a hammer. "You need a roof. I am offering a trade, a marriage, in name only. You sign the paper. You live at the ranch. You will earn your keep. I will not bother you, and the men your husband owed will not bother you either. You will be Mrs. Sterling, my property, by law." The proposition hung in the air, cold and stark as the landscape. Marry this stranger, this scarred, silent man. It was an insult. It was madness. She looked back at the mercantile, at the faces watching from the windows. She saw the saloon door, where she knew men were already placing bets on how long she would last. She had two choices, this man or the street, and the street, for a woman alone with Arthur Hollowell's reputation, was a death sentence. "You agree," he said, seeing the answer in her posture before she gave it. "Yes," Clara said, the word barely a breath. The marriage took place on the porch of the town's small, wind-blasted church. The preacher, Reverend Davies, rushed the words, his eyes focused on the hills beyond Luke's shoulder, as if embarrassed to be part of the transaction. Luke stood silent, his hat in his hands. He smelled of horse, leather, and dust. He did not offer a ring. When the preacher asked for one, Luke merely looked at him until the man cleared his throat and skipped that part of the ceremony. Clara signed her name, Clara Hollowell Sterling, in the preacher's ledger. Her hand did not shake. She felt hollow, carved out, as if she were watching this happen to another woman. The preacher's wife, a woman named Martha Davies, stood on her own porch 50 feet away, her arms crossed tight. She did not come over. She did not nod. She watched Clara sign the ledger as if witnessing a stray dog fouling her yard. The disdain was so thick Clara could almost taste it. When it was done, Luke handed the preacher a coin. "We are going," he said to Clara. He did not help her onto the wagon seat. He moved to the mule, and with a click of his tongue, set them in motion. They rolled out of Grit Creek, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind, and headed west, into the vast, unforgiving emptiness. The ride was 4 hours long. They did not speak a single word. At first, Clara watched the town shrink until it was just a smudge of gray against the brown earth. Then there was nothing but the creak of the wagon wheels and the snap of the wind against the canvas wagon cover. The land opened up, terrifying in its scale. The sky was a huge, aching blue bowl that seemed to press down on them. They climbed into rocky tablelands, navigating canyons that split the earth like old wounds. Sagebrush and juniper clung to the dry soil. Clara held onto the wagon seat, her hands raw. This was not the West of stories. This was a hard, sun-bleached, lonely place. It was a place where a person could disappear and never be missed. Luke Sterling drove the mule with quiet, economical movements. He seemed part of the land itself, scarred, silent, and enduring. Clara studied him from the corner of her eye. He was not an old man, perhaps 30, but the hardness in his eyes and the set of his mouth spoke of a life that had worn him down to the bone. She wondered about the scar, but she knew she would never ask. This was a marriage in name only, a bargain for survival. Questions were not part of the deal. Finally, as the sun began to bleed red light across the western mesas, he turned the wagon into a high, sheltered valley. "We are here," he said. The ranch was not a ranch. It was a wound, just like the canyons. A cabin stood in the center of a clearing, but it was only half a cabin. It was made of raw, unseasoned pine, already graying. One side of the roof was shingled. The other was just bare beams, open to the sky. The front porch sagged. A corral nearby had 3 rails on one side and none on the other. The fences that marked the property line were broken, the posts leaning like drunken soldiers. This was not a home. It was a place where hope had died. It was a mirror of her own life and his. Luke stopped the wagon and climbed down. "The barn is sound," he said, gesturing to a low structure that seemed in better repair than the house. "I sleep there." Clara sat still, the cold of the evening seeping into her bones. She looked at the half-finished house. What happened here?" Luke's face, bathed in the fading light, became unreadable. "My brother started it. He did not finish." He pulled her valise from the wagon. "The cabin is yours. There is a stove. Wood is by the door. The creek is 50 yards east." He set her bag on the sagging porch. Then, without another word, he led the mule and wagon toward the barn, leaving her alone in the twilight. Clara stood on the porch for a long time, the wind howling through the broken fences. A thin, lonely sound. She was Mrs. Sterling. She was the wife of a man who slept in a barn. She was the mistress of a house that was not finished. She pushed open the cabin door. It scraped on the floorboards. The inside was one large room, cold and layered with dust. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, dark and cold. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs were in the middle. In the far corner was a bed frame. Just a frame, with a thin, stained mattress rolled up against the wall. This was her new life. Clara set her jaw. She was not Arthur Hollowell. She would not break. She put her valise on the table and went back outside. The wood pile was small, but it was there. She gathered an armful of split juniper and kindling, carried it inside, and knelt before the stove. Her hands were stiff, clumsy with the cold and the fine tremor of exhaustion. It took her 3 matches, but she got the kindling to catch. She sat back on her heels, watching the small flame flicker, feeding it larger pieces until a weak warmth began to push back against the consuming cold of the high desert night. She heard no sound from the barn. She was alone, truly, terribly alone. Clara did not unroll the mattress. She did not trust the bed. She did not trust the silence. She lay down on the hard floorboards near the stove, pulling her thin coat tighter. She kept her dress and her boots on. She laid her head on her valise, facing the door, and watched the firelight paint moving shadows on the raw wood walls. Later, much later, she heard the cry of a coyote, sharp and hungry, answered by another. The wind picked up, rattling the canvas Luke's brother had tacked over the empty window frame. The sound was like dry bones scratching at the glass. In the barn, Luke lay on his own bedroll, his eyes open in the dark. He listened to the wind. He listened to the house. He heard her moving, heard the scrape of the stove door. He had seen the way she looked at the cabin, the same way they all looked at it, with despair. He had not lied to her. It was a marriage in name only. He needed her signature to stop the bank in Santa Fe from seizing Amos's land. Amos had worked himself to death for this patch of dirt. Luke would not let it go. But the law was the law. The inheritance clause required a wife. He ran a hand over his scarred cheek. He remembered the last woman who had lived in that house. Sarah, his brother's wife, a pretty, laughing woman from Ohio who loved lace and songs. She had hated the wind. She had hated the dirt. Luke closed his eyes, but the memory came anyway. He had been riding fence line 10 miles north, checking for strays. He saw the smoke first, a thick black pillar against the clean blue sky. He rode his horse until its lungs burned. He was too late. The renegades were gone. The cattle were gone. And Amos was lying by the half-finished porch, shot twice. Luke had carried his brother inside. He had called for Sarah. The cabin was empty, but it was not the emptiness of a raid. Her trunk was gone. Her jewelry box was gone. The best horse, the mare Amos had bought her, was gone. She had not even stayed to bury her husband, the first sign of real hardship, of blood and loss. And she had run. She ran from the wind, ran from the work, ran from the death. Luke had buried his brother alone, his hands raw from digging in the hard earth. He had sworn 2 things that day. He would finish the ranch Amos started, and he would never again trust the softness of a woman. They were not made for this land. They were made for leaving. He listened again. In the cabin, Clara was not crying. He had expected tears. He had expected her to break, to hammer on his door and demand he take her back. There was only silence. The next morning, when the sun cut a sharp line across the valley floor, Luke emerged from the barn. He carried his saddle, ready to ride the fence line. He stopped. Clara was outside, by the creek. She had found a bucket somewhere and was hauling water back to the cabin. Her black dress was already stained with mud at the hem. She did not look at him. She walked with her back straight, her steps measured, fighting the weight of the water. He watched her disappear inside the cabin. A moment later, smoke, thicker this time, a steady plume, rose from the chimney. He stood there for a long time, the saddle heavy in his hand. He looked at the half-finished house, at the smoke, at the woman who had not run in the night. He did not trust her. He could not. Trust was a luxury this land did not permit. But as he swung the saddle onto his horse, he found himself watching the cabin door, a strange, tight feeling in his chest. Inside, Clara was on her knees, scrubbing the floorboards with a rag she had torn from her own petticoat. She scrubbed away the grime, the dust, the footprint of the woman who had left. She worked until her shoulders burned and her hands were raw. It was not hope. It was survival. The uneasy partnership had begun. Two lonely souls, bound by a piece of paper, trapped by the land, and separated by a silence as vast as the sky above them. The high desert was a relentless teacher. It taught Clara that her hands, once soft and smooth, were useless. The handle of Luke's axe was heavy, the wood unforgiving. In the first week, her palms blistered, then broke, then bled. She wept in the night, silently, biting down on her own torn hand so he would not hear her from the barn. But she did not stop. By the third week, the blisters had hardened into calluses. The ache in her back from splitting juniper was a dull, constant companion. She learned to swing the axe with her whole body, not just her arms. She learned to stack the wood so the air could dry it. She learned the sound of the wind was not a howl, but a voice, and it always warned of the cold. She worked inside the cabin too, in a rawhide trunk left in the corner. She found old linens, stiff with disuse. They must have belonged to Sarah, the woman who had fled. Clara took them to the creek, the water so cold it burned her skin, and she scrubbed them with lye soap until the yellowing faded. She hung them to dry on a line she made from frayed rope. That night, she sat by the fire, her fingers stiff, and stitched them into curtains. It was a small thing, a useless thing, perhaps. But when the wind rattled the canvas over the window, the curtains blocked the draft. They made the raw, half-finished cabin feel almost like a room. She tended the horses. There were two geldings and the mule. They were wary of her at first, their big eyes watching her every move. She brought them water. She brushed their coats, working the alkali dust out of their manes. She started talking to them, her voice low and soft. "He's a quiet one, isn't he?" she'd whisper to the sorrel gelding, who seemed the most patient. "But I suppose you are, too. It's this land. It drains the words right out of you." Luke watched all of it. He watched from the fence line he was mending. He watched from the barn doorway as he oiled his saddle. He saw her hands, raw and red. He saw her stagger under the weight of the water buckets. He saw her pause, stretch her back, and then bend to the work again. He remembered Sarah's complaints about the dust on her piano, the wind ruining her hair, the silence driving her mad. This woman, Clara, did not complain. She just worked. She met the harshness of the land with a quiet, brittle harshness of her own. He did not help her. He had to know. He had to see if she was like Sarah. He had to see when she would break, when she would run. Every morning, he woke half expecting to find the cabin empty, her valise gone. But every morning, he saw the plume of smoke from her stove. He did not trust her. This was a performance. She wanted something. The ranch, security. She was just smarter than Sarah. She knew work was the price. His silence remained a wall, high and thick. He gave her orders, when necessary. "The creek's running low. Use the well." Or, "That wood's green. Use the dry stack." She would just nod, her face smudged with soot, and do it. After a month, the supplies they had brought were gone. The flour sack was empty, the coffee tin down to its last grounds. "We go to town," he said at dawn. The ride to Grit Creek was as silent as the ride out had been. Clara sat straight on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the black dress, mended now at the elbow. She had washed it, but it was still the color of old grief. Grit Creek had not changed. It was still gray, still huddled, still watching. As they pulled up to the mercantile, Clara felt the eyes on her. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, was sweeping her porch. She stopped. She watched Clara climb down from the wagon, and her mouth pinched into a thin line of distaste. Inside the store, Mr. Hames was polite, but his politeness was cold. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, the name sounding strange, as Luke loaded sacks of flour, beans, and salt. Clara felt the whispers. 2 women, wives of local ranchers, were by the bolt goods. They did not bother to lower their voices. "Look at that, bold as brass. Thought she'd be gone by now. Arthur Hollowell's bad luck. I suppose it's Luke Sterling's now. I heard she trapped him, used that gambler's money, what was left of it." "There was no money," the other whispered, leaning closer. "Hames said she had nothing but a locket. She's a gold digger, plain and simple, only it's a scarred-up hermit she dug. A fallen woman and a broken man. They deserve each other." Clara felt the blood rush to her face. She turned, her eyes meeting the women's. They did not look away. They stared back, their faces hard with righteousness. Luke heard it. He stopped, his hand on a sack of oats. His back was to Clara, but she saw his shoulders tense. The scar on his cheek stood out, white against the sudden flush of his skin. He said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not look at the women. He turned, paid Mr. Hames in coin, and lifted the oats. "Wait in the wagon," he said, his voice flat. Clara walked out, her head high, the bell jangling her exit. The women's quiet, satisfied laughter followed her. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her hands trembling. His silence was a betrayal. It was a punishment. It confirmed what they said. She was his. Yes, but she was something to be ashamed of. His silence was his agreement. Luke came out, loading the last of the supplies. He was about to untie the mule when 3 men emerged from the saloon. One of them, a thick-set man with a stained beard, swayed on his feet. He squinted at the wagon. His name was Mort Barrows, one of the men Arthur had owed the most. Well, Barrows slurred, his eyes landing on Clara. He hitched his trousers and sauntered closer. "If it ain't the dead gamblers. Leavings?" Luke froze, his hand on the hitching rope. "I heard you was shacked up," Barrows continued, ignoring Luke and smiling at Clara. It was a wet, ugly smile. "Took you for someone with better taste. Girly. Though I suppose beggars can't be particular." Clara felt the old, cold fear, but beneath it was the new, hot anger, the anger that had come from splitting wood and hauling water. "You will not speak to me," she said, her voice low and shaking. Barrows laughed, a harsh bark. "I'll speak how I please. You're Arthur's cast-off. He owed me plenty. Maybe you're the first payment." He was close now, close enough for her to smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. He reached out, his filthy hand grabbing the sleeve of her dress. "Come on, little widow. I'll show you what a real man." It happened faster than a breath. Luke had dropped the rope. He took one step. He did not speak. He did not warn. His right hand, hard as cured leather, shot out and struck Mort Barrows square in the jaw. It was not a brawl. It was an execution. The sound was a dull, wet crack. Barrows' eyes rolled back, and he dropped like a sack of feed, hitting the dusty street and not moving. The other 2 men stumbled backward, their hands raised. The street went dead silent. Luke stood over the man, breathing hard. He looked down at his own hand, at his knuckles, as if he did not recognize them. He looked surprised. He had not meant to do that, or perhaps he had meant to do it for a month. He turned, his face a mask of cold fury. He grabbed Clara's arm, but it was a different grab than Barrows's. It was hard, possessive, and terrified. "Get in the wagon," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He was already in the driver's seat, slapping the reins. The mule lurched forward, and the wagon rattled out of Grit Creek, leaving Mort Barrows unconscious in the dust and the whole town staring. The ride home was violent. Luke pushed the mule to a punishing trot, the wagon wheels slamming into ruts, jolting Clara until her teeth ached. She held onto the seat, her heart pounding. He was silent for the first mile, the set of his jaw harder than rock. "You fool," he finally said, his voice tearing through the wind. Clara flinched. He touched me." "And you talked back," Luke roared, pulling the mule to a halt so suddenly the horses in the back whinnied. He turned on her, his eyes blazing. "You don't talk, you don't look, you don't give them a reason. What do you think this is, a parlor game? That's Mort Barrows. He'd as soon kill a man as look at him. And you challenged him. He called me." "Do you think I care what he called you?" Luke shouted. "He called you weak. He called you alone. You invited him in. You think words matter? Out here, words are just noise before the bullet. You drew attention. You painted a target on us. On my ranch." Clara stared at him, stunned into silence. He was right. She knew he was right. But the unfairness of it, the shame of it, choked her. He kept glaring at her, his chest heaving. And then the fire in his eyes died. Just a little. It was replaced by something else, a flicker of something. It was concern. It was the look of a man who had seen something valuable almost broken. You cannot be that reckless," he said, his voice dropping. "You cannot. This land, it doesn't forgive." He turned away from her, slapped the reins, and they drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was heavier and more complicated than any they had shared before. That night, the sky broke. A storm rolled in from the north, a wall of black cloud that smothered the stars. The wind did not howl. It screamed. Rain came down in sheets, a cold, driving deluge that sounded like gravel on the roof. Clara lit every lamp she had, but the cabin remained dark, the corners filled with shadows. The wind found every crack in the chinking, and then the leaks began. The half-finished roof, the part Amos had never shingled, gave way. Water dripped, then streamed onto the floor. Clara moved the table, moved her valise, but it was hopeless. The cabin door burst open, and Luke stumbled in, carrying his saddle. He was soaked to the skin, his hat dripping. "The barn. The wind took the north door off its hinges," he said, dropping the saddle. He looked around at the puddles on the floor. He went to the stove, his back to her, and just stood there, dripping. He was holding his right hand tucked against his chest. Clara looked at him, at this large, broken man in his broken house. The anger from the wagon was gone, washed away by the storm. "You're hurt," she said. He shook his head. "It's nothing." "Let me see." She moved toward him. "I said it's nothing." She stopped. "You're bleeding on my floor, Mr. Sterling, the floor I scrubbed." He looked down. A small, dark drop of blood had fallen from his hand. He sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion, and sat heavily at the table. He held out his right hand. The knuckles were split open, raw and swollen from his punch. They were dirty, caked with dried blood and mud. Clara went to her valise. She pulled out a clean strip of linen she had saved from her curtain making, and the small bottle of carbolic acid she kept for emergencies. She poured water from the kettle, still warm, into a bowl. She sat opposite him. The table was small. The storm outside made the cabin feel like the inside of a drum. Rain pounded on the roof. She placed his hand in the bowl. He flinched, not at the water, she realized, but at her touch. His hand was large, rough, calloused. Her fingers felt small against his. She washed the wound gently. He did not move. He just watched her. His eyes, in the lamplight, were not cold. They were watchful. The closeness was unsettling. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the rain on his clothes, the scent of wet wool and pine. She concentrated on her task. Her head bent. She felt his gaze on her hair, on her hands. A strange, quiet flicker, like heat lightning, passed between them. It was a current, an awareness. It was desire, buried so deep it barely had a name. She finished cleaning the wound and began to wrap it with the linen. Her fingers brushed his palm. I used to want to be a teacher," she said, the words coming out in a whisper, just to break the spell. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Back in Pennsylvania," she said, her voice catching. "I had my certificate. I loved books. I was going to teach children how to read. My life wasn't supposed to." She gestured at the cabin, at the water dripping on the floor. "It wasn't supposed to be this, before Arthur, before..." She finished the bandage, tying it off. She did not let go of his hand. Luke stared into the fire. The light played over his scarred cheek. He was quiet for so long she thought he had not heard her. "My mother," he said, his voice low, rough. "She liked books." Clara looked up, surprised. "She read to us, Amos and me, every night." He paused, his thumb moving, just barely, against her fingers. "Raiders. Back in Kansas. They came at night. They set the house on fire." He pulled his hand from hers. Not unkindly, just retreating. "She didn't get out," he said to the fire. "I was 12. He said nothing else. He stood up, the chair scraping on the wet floor. The confession hung in the air, brutal and unfinished. He had shared his deepest wound, and now he had to escape it. "The horses," he muttered, and went to the door. "Luke," she said. He stopped, his hand on the latch. "Stay," she said. "The barn isn't safe. You'll catch your death." He looked back at her. She gestured to the dry patch of floor near the stove, where her own bedroll was. "It's dry. Over here." He hesitated. The wind tore at the door. He nodded. Once, he fetched his own bedroll from the barn, fighting the storm, and laid it on the floor, a good 6 feet from hers. They lay in the dark, two lonely souls on a floor, listening to the world try to tear their house apart. But for the first time, they were together, and the cabin, for all its leaks, felt a little warmer. The morning was devastating. The rain had stopped, but the wind had reshaped their world. The creek had overrun its banks, and the corral was gone. A whole section of fence, the part Luke had been mending, had been torn down. The posts were snapped like twigs. Luke stood on the porch, his bandaged hand at his side, and just stared. Clara saw his shoulders slump. This was one blow too many. The loss of the horses would be the end of them. "They're gone," he whispered. "No," Clara said. She pointed up the valley. The sorrel and the other gelding were huddled in a grove of cottonwoods, safe on high ground. Luke's relief was a sharp exhale. But the work was overwhelming. Clara went back inside. She returned with his axe. She held it out to him. "Where do we start?" she asked. He looked at her. At the determination in her eyes, he took the axe. "The wood line. We need new posts." They worked all day. The ground was a sea of mud, thick and sucking. It pulled at Clara's boots, making every step an effort. He cut the posts. She helped him drag them. He dug the holes, his body straining. She held the posts steady while he tamped the earth. They did not speak. There was no need. A rhythm found them. He lifted the heavy driver. She braced the post. Thud, thud, thud. He moved to the next one. She followed. They moved as a team, two parts of one machine. He grunted with effort. She strained, her muscles burning. They were bound by the labor, finding a strange, shared balance in the mud. By dusk, the fence was up. It was ugly, it was crooked, but it was strong. They stood, caked in mud, exhausted, breathing hard. Luke wiped his arm across his face, leaving a streak of dirt. He looked at the new fence line. Then he looked at Clara. Her dress was ruined. Her hair had fallen from its pins and was plastered to her face. And her hands, her poor hands, were bleeding again. The new calluses torn. "You did good work," he said. His voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for the help." Clara leaned on the post, the wood rough against her cheek. She was tired, bone-tired, but she was not broken. She felt a small, fierce smile touch her lips. A smirk. She looked him square in the eye. "I'm just your wife in name, remember?" Luke's face changed. He had expected gratitude, perhaps. He had not expected her defiance. He just looked at her. His gaze lingered, traveling from her muddy boots, up her torn dress, to her defiant, tired eyes. It was a look that was no longer assessing. It was something else. It was dark, and it was warm, and it made the air between them thick. He said nothing. He turned, picked up the axe, and walked back to the barn, his shoulders straight. The mud of the storm's aftermath had no time to dry. It froze solid, the ground becoming hard and unforgiving, ridged with icy boot prints. Then the snow came. It did not come violently, but softly, in the night. Clara woke to a world that had been silenced. The wind was gone, and the sky was a low, heavy gray. Thick flakes drifted past the window, and the half-finished roof beams of the cabin were capped in white. The snow fell for 3 days. When it stopped, the tattered S Ranch was no longer a ranch. It was a white, empty bowl, isolated from everything. The mesas were gone, hidden by cloud. The road to Grit Creek was gone, buried under 3 feet of powder. They were alone. The silence was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. The cold was not just outside. It was a guest in the cabin. It seeped through the chinking Luke had yet to finish. It crept under the door. It lived in the corners. Their world shrank to the 20 feet of the cabin and the 50 yards of the path Luke shoveled to the barn. Supplies, once just low, became precious. The coffee was measured in pinches, the flour in careful scoops. The salt was a small, hard brick. Their diet was beans, salt pork, and the hardtack Luke had stored. The cold settled into Clara's chest. It began as a tickle, an irritation in her throat. She tried to hide it, coughing into her sleeve when Luke was outside. But the cold was persistent. By the 2nd week of the snow, the tickle had become a cough, a dry, racking sound that echoed in the tiny cabin. Luke said nothing, but his actions changed. The sound of his axe striking wood became the only punctuation to their days. He worked relentlessly, chopping until a mountain of juniper and pine stood by the door. He would burst into the cabin, his shoulders covered in snow, and dump a heavy armload of wood into the box. "Keep the stove hot," he'd grunt. "It's cold enough to freeze a man's words. Don't waste it." One morning, she woke coughing, her throat raw. He was standing by the stove, his back to her. He shoved a tin cup onto the table. Hard. Hot water sloshed over the rim. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a rasp. "Tea, pine needle." He did not turn. "My mother made it. It's bitter. Drink it." He was worried. She knew it. The gruffness was his only way of showing it. He was worried she was like Sarah, like his mother. Another woman who would be broken by the harshness of the land. Another woman he would fail to save. The thought made Clara drink the bitter tea, even as it scalded her throat. One night, the cold deepened. A clear sky had opened up, and the stars looked like chips of ice. Without the clouds as a blanket, the temperature plummeted. Clara fed the stove, but the fire seemed thin. She wrapped herself in her thin coat and her one blanket and lay down on her bedroll by the hearth. The cold found her. It went through the wool, through her dress, into her bones. She must have fallen asleep, because she woke, shivering so hard her teeth clicked. She was not coughing, just shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor. She heard a sound, a scrape of a boot. Luke was standing over her, a shadow against the firelight. He had been watching her. He had been sleeping in the cabin since the storm, on his own bedroll. in the farthest, coldest corner, as far from her as he could get. She tried to stop the shaking, but she could not. He did not speak. He bent down, in one smooth, powerful motion. He slid one arm under her back and the other under her knees, and lifted her. She gasped. She weighed nothing to him. He was so warm. The heat of his body, even through his shirt, was a shock. She was all sharp, cold angles and bones in his arms. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides. His own bed was a low frame built into the wall, layered with the thick furs of animals he had trapped, wolf and coyote. It was his one place of comfort, his one private space. He laid her down in the center of the furs. They were soft, dense, and instantly, shockingly warm. They smelled of cured leather, cedar, and him. She stopped shivering, just for a second, startled by the intimacy of it. He stood over her, his face in shadow. Then he took off his own heavy wool coat, the one he always wore, and spread it over her. It was heavy as lead, and it smelled of horse and snow. She was buried in warmth. She was buried in him. She looked up, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. He was just a dark shape, ready to retreat. "You're kinder than you pretend," she whispered, her voice rough from the cough. He flinched. The words hit him like stones. Kindness was a weakness. It was a failing. It was the thing that had gotten his brother killed. He took a step back, turned, and retreated to the fire. He sat on the floor, his back to her, and began feeding the stove, piece by piece, as if guarding the cabin against the night. He did not lie down again. When Clara woke, the cabin was gray with early light. She was warm, deeply, wonderfully warm. The cough in her chest felt looser, quieter. She sat up, the heavy coat pooling in her lap. She was in his bed. The smell of him was everywhere. A strange, slow heat rose in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. The cabin was empty. She got up, her movements stiff. She folded his coat, her hands lingering on the rough wool, and placed it on the furs. She went to the door and looked out. The world was white and blue. Luke was gone. His horse was gone from the corral. The rifle was gone from its pegs. A small knot of fear tightened in her stomach. He had just left. No word, nothing. He had shared his warmth, and then he had fled from it. She spent the day in a state of uneasy waiting. She scrubbed the floor. She made bean soup. She listened to the silence. Around noon, she heard the sound of harness jingles. Relief washed through her, so strong her knees weakened. He was back, but it was not Luke's horse. It was a sway-backed mare pulling a small buckboard. A woman sat on the seat, wrapped in a man's coat. Clara went to the door. The woman pulled the mare to a stop. It was Mrs. Weaver, the preacher's wife's sister, a ranch wife from the next valley over. She was a woman made of rawhide and gristle, and her eyes missed nothing. "Mrs. Sterling," the woman called, not climbing down. "Saw your smoke. Figured you wasn't dead yet." "Mrs. Weaver," Clara said, pulling her thin shawl tighter. "It's good to see a face. Will you come in? I have water for coffee." Mrs. Weaver considered this. "Got my own." She reached into her wagon and pulled out a small cloth sack. "And some jerky. You look thin, girl. This valley will eat a person alive if they let it." She tied her horse and stomped the snow off her boots on the porch. Inside, she looked around, her eyes taking in the curtains, the scrubbed floor, and the 2 bedrolls. Fixing it up," she said. She handed Clara the coffee. "Heard in town you married Sterling." "I did," Clara said, her voice quiet. She busied herself with the coffee pot. "Brave of you," Mrs. Weaver said, sitting at the table. "It's a strong cabin," Clara replied, echoing her thoughts from town. "I ain't talking about the cabin, child. I'm talking about the man." Mrs. Weaver leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You know about his family, I suppose?" Clara shook her head, though she knew of Amos and the fire. "They're unlucky," Mrs. Weaver said, her eyes intense. "Cursed is what my mother always said. And the good Lord knows it's followed them from Kansas. Clara stopped, the pot in her hand. I don't hold with superstition, Mrs. Weaver. It ain't superstition when it's true, the older woman snapped. His PA died in that fire his own ma set, or so the story goes. And his ma, well, she died in it too. And then they come here, Luke and Amos. And what happens? Amos gets himself shot full of holes by renegades. Right on that porch you're standing on. Right there. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. And his wife, Mrs., Weaver said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Sarah, pretty little thing. Blonde hair, skin like milk. This land broke her. After Amos died, she went mad, plumb mad. Walked right into the river just before the first freeze. They say she walks that bank at night, still looking for a way out. Mrs. Weaver picked up the cup of coffee Clara poured, her hand steady. Any woman who gets tied to a sterling man, she ends up ruined, or dead, or both. It's a curse, plain and simple. You be careful, child. That man, he's got his mother's eyes, but he's got his father's luck, and it's all bad. Clara forced a laugh. It was a thin, brittle sound that cracked in the cold air. Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Weaver, and the jerky. I have mending to do before dark. The older woman nodded, satisfied. She had delivered her warning. She drank her coffee, stood, and left, climbing back into her buckboard and disappearing into the white silence. Clara stood by the window, the laugh gone from her face, ruined. She looked at Luke's bedroll, at the furs. She touched her throat. The cough was gone. Dusk was settling, turning the snow from white to a deep, bruised purple. When he returned, he was not riding. He was walking, leading the horse which was limping. He looked spent. He moved like an old man. His shoulders slumped. He stopped at the barn, unsaddled the horse, and threw a dead coyote onto the snow pile. He walked to the cabin and pushed the door open. Clara gasped. His shirt, down his left side, was soaked in a dark, wet stain. It was blood. You're hurt, she said, her voice flat, the single word cursed echoing in her head. It's nothing. He grunted, pushing past her toward the water bucket. That is not nothing. Luke, there's so much blood. He splashed icy water on his face, then looked at his shirt. It's not mine. He was angry, defensive. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the shelf, his hand shaking slightly. Whose is it? She pressed, her heart hammering. The coyote? No. He would not look at her. He poured a heavy measure of whiskey into his tin cup and drank it in one pull. What happened? Luke? It's handled, he said, his voice low and dangerous. What is handled? Mrs. Weaver was here today. He froze, the cup halfway to his mouth. What did that old crow want? She told me, Clara said, her voice gaining a desperate edge. She told me about your family, about Sarah, about your brother, about the curse. She had no right, he whispered, turning to face her. His eyes were dark. She said any woman who comes near you is ruined, and now you come back, covered in blood you won't explain. Is that what I am to you? Am I just another part of your bad luck? Luke, another woman to be ruined? He slammed the cup on the table. It bounced and fell. You don't trust me. It was not a question. It was the old wound, the one Sarah had left. It was the deepest cut he had. You don't let me, Clara cried, the fear and frustration of weeks finally breaking. You hide in the barn. You talk in grunts. You come and go with blood on your shirt. You move me to your bed like I'm a person, and then you look at me like I'm a snake. What am I supposed to trust? You're supposed to trust that I am keeping you safe, he roared, his voice cracking the silence of the cabin. That wasn't a coyote I was tracking. It was Barrows, Mort Barrows. He was out here, setting traps. Not for animals, for us. Clara went cold. The man from the street. The man he had struck. He was hunting us? He figured the snow would hide his tracks. He was wrong, Luke looked at his hands. He was at the canyon edge. His horse slipped. He fell. And the blood, she whispered. I tried to grab him, Luke said, his face a mask. His coat, it tore. He fell. She stared at him, at his cold face, at the blood on his shirt. She did not know if he was lying. She did not know if he had tried to grab him, or if he had pushed him. The curse felt real. It felt like it was standing in the cabin with them. You believe her, he said, his voice suddenly dead. You believe the old woman. You're just like her. You're just like Sarah. You see the blood, and you run. I'm not running, she shouted. No, he sneered, the scar on his face pulling his mouth into a bitter line. You're just standing there, judging me, thinking I'm a monster. He grabbed his coat, the one she had been sleeping in, from the bed. He yanked the door open and stormed out into the black, freezing night. The door slammed shut, rattling the tin cups on the shelf. Clara stood in the silence. He was right. She was judging him. She waited. An hour, 2. The fire burned low. He did not go to the barn. She knew he wouldn't. He was out there, in the cold, punishing himself. She could not bear it. She pulled her own thin coat on, wrapped her shawl over her head, and went out. The snow was falling again. Soft, quiet flakes that stung her cheeks. The cold was a physical blow. She followed his tracks, deep and angry in the new snow. They led away from the ranch, toward the low, dark line of the river. The same river Mrs. Weaver had spoken of. She found him. He was sitting on a fallen log, his back to her, staring at the black, rushing water that cut through the white land. The snow was collecting on his shoulders, on his hat. He had not brushed it off. She approached slowly, her boots crunching. Luke? He did not turn. You'll freeze, she said softly. He said nothing. He was holding something in his hands. He was staring at it. She moved closer, standing beside him. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and dark, held in both his scarred, bandaged hands. It was not her locket. Luke, what is that? He opened his hand, as if the effort was immense. The locket fell open. In the faint moonlight, she could see a tiny, intricate lock of blonde hair. It was Sarah's, he whispered. His voice was broken, all the anger gone, leaving only a vast, empty space. Your brother's wife, Clara said. He shook his head, a small, pained movement. No, she was, he swallowed. I gave it to her. Before Amos ever met her, back in Kansas. Clara stopped breathing. The cold, the river, the snow, it all came together. You loved her. I loved her since we were children, he said, his voice flat with an old pain. She was bright, like sunlight. She wasn't made for this land. She wasn't made for me. What happened? Clara asked, sinking onto the log beside him. I brought her here. I wrote to her, told her to come west. I thought I'd have a claim by then, but I had nothing, just dust. He looked at the half-finished cabin, barely visible in the dark. Amos, he had the deed to this place. He was stable. He offered her a home, a finished home. He married her. The agony in that last sentence was a living thing. She married him, Luke continued, his voice so low she could barely hear him over the river. But she still looked at me, and I looked at her. We never, but Amos knew. He saw it. It's why he worked so hard, why he was so reckless with the renegades. He was trying to buy her happiness, to beat me. He closed his eyes, the snow clinging to his lashes. When the raiders came, I was gone. I was checking the far fences. I should have been here. Amos was alone. Luke, that wasn't your fault. When I got back, he said, his voice cracking, he was dead, and she was inside. She hadn't run. She was just sitting, staring at the wall. She never spoke again, not one word. He looked at the dark, swirling water. The town? Mrs. Weaver? They all think she went mad from the raid, that she wandered out and fell in, but I know." He held up the locket. "She left this on the bank. For me. She couldn't live with it." With what? With what we had done. With Amos gone. She tied her apron strings to a rock. I found her. Right here. The truth was so much worse than the gossip. His guilt was not just for his brother. It was for Sarah. It was for the love that had destroyed them all. He was not cursed. He was haunted. He was shivering. A deep, bone-shaking tremor that had nothing to do with the snow. Clara's heart ached, not with fear, not with judgment, with a profound, deep, shared sorrow. This was the man who had covered her with his coat. She sat beside him. She did not say it was okay. She did not say it was not his fault. Words were useless. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out, her fingers, chapped and raw, touched the back of his hand, the one holding the locket. His skin was like ice. "You deserve peace, Luke," she whispered. He flinched, a violent, full-body tremor, as if her touch was fire. He snatched his hand back, pulling it away, but he only pulled it an inch. He did not stand. He did not run. He just sat there, his hand trembling in the small space between them, his fist clenched tight, hiding the locket from the snow, from her, and from himself. The confession by the river changed the air between them. The night, the snow, the shared, terrible secret. It had stripped them bare. When they returned to the cabin, the silence that settled was no longer empty. It was full of the things they now knew. The snow did not stop. It thickened. Days blurred into a long, white twilight. The sun a pale memory behind a ceiling of endless gray. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the path to the barn, and the snow-muffled sound of Luke's axe. They were forced into a proximity that was more intimate than a touch. They began to truly rely on each other. It was no longer just his work and her work. When his bandaged hand, the one he'd split on Barrows's jaw, stiffened in the cold, she would take the bucket from him. When her cough returned, a shallow rasp in the pre-dawn cold, he would leave the tin of pine needle tea by her bedroll before he left. Their meals, once eaten in tense silence at opposite ends of the table, became a shared ritual. It was the only punctuation in the day. They sat by the stove, the tin plates on their knees, the steam from the bean soup rising between them, and they began to talk. The talk was not of blood, or debt, or the women who haunted them. It was small, safe stories from a life before. "My PA," Luke said one night, staring into the flames of the stove. He could find water anywhere. He'd cut a willow switch and just walk, and it would dip. Never failed. Amos, he thought it was magic. "And you?" Clara asked. Her voice soft. He almost smiled. The scar on his cheek pulled, a faint lightening of the tissue. "I figured he just knew where to look, but I never learned the trick of it." Clara offered one of her own. "My mother had a garden, back in Pennsylvania. The soil was black, not this." She gestured to the window, to the white and brown. "She grew peonies, big as your fist, pink and white, the smell, on a summer morning. It was the first thing you'd smell when you woke up." She looked at her hands, calloused and chapped. "I tried to plant some seeds, once, in a pot, before. They never even sprouted. They lived on these small ghosts of memory. They were building a fragile bridge, piece by piece, over the chasm of their pasts. One afternoon, a brief, weak shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds. It was so startling they both stopped what they were doing. Luke was whittling a new handle for a tool. Clara was mending his shirt. The light hit a patch of the floor, illuminating the dust motes. Luke looked at the light, then at Clara. A low sound rumbled in his chest. It was a laugh. It was dry, rusty, as if the mechanism had forgotten how to work. Clara, startled, looked at him. A smile, real and sudden, touched her own mouth. She laughed, too. It was not a giggle, but a quiet, breathless sound of surprise. The moment lasted 5 seconds. Then the cloud sealed. The light was gone, and the cabin was gray again. They looked away from each other, embarrassed. But the sound of it, that brief, shared warmth, lingered in the air. The cold snap came a week later. The sun disappeared entirely for 4 days. A deep, penetrating cold settled in. A cold that the stove could not fight. It made the cabin logs pop and groan. The snow-covered world outside was utterly silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clara could not sleep. The cold had found a way inside her bedroll. She lay awake, listening to the cabin settle, listening to the faint, steady sound of Luke's breathing from his own bed of furs. She was too cold. Her feet were numb. She sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. The fire in the stove was burning low, the red glow barely visible through the grate. She needed to add wood, or the cold would take the cabin completely by morning. She crept, barefoot, across the icy floorboards. She expected to find Luke asleep. He was not. He was sitting on the low stool by the stove, his back to her. He was tending the fire, but he was doing it half-dressed. He wore his trousers, but he was shirtless. The firelight played on the skin of his back. Clara stopped, her hand half raised to her mouth. His back was not the smooth, muscled expanse she had imagined. It was a map of old, terrible pain. Thick, white scars, long-heeled, crisscrossed his shoulders and ribs. They were not the clean lines of a blade. They were ragged, puckered, overlapping. The marks of a beating, a lashing. This was not the mark of a fair fight. This was the mark of a man who had once been helpless, tied down, and hurt. This was a vulnerability he never showed, a pain that dwarfed the scar on his face. He must have hurt her. He did not turn, but his whole body tensed, the scarred muscles cording. He was waiting for her to speak, to question, to pity him. He was waiting for her to retreat. Clara did not retreat. She moved forward, her steps silent on the wood floor. The cold air raised goose flesh on her arms, but she barely felt it. She was focused on the firelight on his skin, on the story written there. She stopped just behind him. She could feel the heat from the stove, and the heat from him. He was still rigid as stone. Slowly, she raised her hand. It was trembling. She hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air just above his shoulder. Then, she touched him. She laid her palm flat against his skin, her fingers tracing the ridge of a thick scar. Luke flinched, a violent, full-body shudder, a sharp intake of breath, as if she had branded him. But he did not pull away. He just froze. He closed his eyes. His breathing stopped. She did not pull her hand back. She left it there, a point of warmth on his cold, damaged skin. She said nothing. Her touch was her only question, her only comfort. The air in the cabin thickened. The silence was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire and the sudden, ragged sound of his breathing. He still had not turned. She could feel the tremor starting in his shoulders. It was not from cold. He turned, slowly, on the stool. His face was a mask of agony and something else, something she had only seen in flashes, a deep, desperate yearning that terrified him. His eyes met hers. They were dark, full of all the ghosts he carried. He looked at her hand, still resting on his shoulder, and then back at her face. He raised his own hand, the one that was not bandaged. It was rough, scarred from work. He brought it to her face, his fingers hesitant, clumsy. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His calloused thumb grazed her jaw. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, a small, involuntary movement of seeking warmth. That was all it took. He leaned in, slow, hesitant, trembling. She met him halfway. Their kiss was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of collision. It was slow and chaste and trembling. It was the taste of wood smoke and salt and the cold metal of the night. It was two frozen, starving people finding a crust of bread. It was hesitant, fearful, as if they both expected to be struck. His other hand came up, gripping her arm, holding her steady. or holding himself steady. She brought her other hand to his chest, feeling the frantic, hard beat of his heart beneath his skin. The dam broke. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a sudden, desperate need. He pulled her closer, his mouth pressing harder against hers. It was still not a skilled kiss. It was a hungry one. It was a kiss of loneliness. He stood, pulling her up with him, never breaking contact. He backed her against the wall, his body pressing hers, his mouth seeking her neck, her jaw, her ear. He was breathing hard, ragged gasps. "Clara," he whispered, her name a prayer or a curse. This was not tenderness. This was a raw, primal need to feel something other than cold and pain. It was bound to all his old grief, to the guilt over Sarah, to the violence he carried, and for Clara. It was the first touch that was not a bargain or a threat. It was a choice. He lifted her. As he had that night, he carried her to his bed. This time, there was no gentleness. This time, there was a desperate strength. He carried her the 2 steps to his bed of furs and laid her down, following her, covering her body with his. The night was filled with tenderness and fear. Their movements were clumsy, urgent, shadowed by the ghosts in the room. Every touch was a question. Every caress was a confession. They moved together in the cold darkness, 2 broken souls seeking solace, their desire bound so tightly to their old pain they could not be separated. They were not making love. They were trying to survive. In the first gray light of morning, Clara woke. She was tangled in the furs, in Luke's arms. His body was a solid, warm weight against her back. His breathing was deep and even. A profound quiet filled her. She lay still, processing. She felt still. She was not ashamed. She was not afraid. She was just quiet. The world had shifted. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was something else. Luke woke slowly. He tensed, feeling her beside him. He did not move, but his breathing changed. He was awake. He was uncertain. He had broken the bargain. He had taken the one thing he swore he would not. He had touched her. He had taken his comfort. He was sure, ruined everything. He was waiting for her tears, for her accusations. Clara did not move. She did not cry. She just lay there, her back to him, breathing. The silence stretched. It was a new silence, full of the weight of the night. Finally, Luke moved. He slipped out of the bed, his movements careful, as if not to wake her, though he knew she was awake. He pulled on his shirt, his back to her, hiding his scars again. He put on his boots. He did not look at her. He went to the stove, his movements stiff, and started the fire, adding wood with sharp, angry gestures. He was pretending nothing had happened. He was retreating to his chores. Clara watched him, the straight, rigid line of his back. The distance between them had never felt so vast. The thaw came a week later. A warm wind, a chinook, blew down from the mountains. The snow began to melt, rivers of slush cutting through the drifts. The world dripped. The sound was deafening after the silence, and with the thaw came the mail rider, a young man on a strong horse, his face raw from the wind. He brought a single, mud-stained letter. Luke took it, his face grim. It was from the bank in Santa Fe. He opened it by the fire. Clara watched his face. The scar whitened. He crushed the letter in his fist. "What is it?" "The bank," he said, his voice flat. "Amos's loan. They're calling it the snow, the raids. They say the land is forfeit. We have 2 weeks, or they seize it." 2 weeks. Can we sell the cattle?" "What cattle?" he said, his voice bitter. "The renegades took the best. The rest are thin. Barrows. Barrows scattered the rest. We have nothing. Losing the ranch. It was the end. For him. It was the loss of his brother's last wish. For her. For her. It was the street. It was Grit Creek. It was the whispers and the hands of men like Mort Barrows. "I'll go to town," she said, her voice quiet, but firm. Luke looked up, his eyes sharp. "No. I'll go to Grit Creek, to Mr. Hames. He trusts you. Maybe he can..." Lend us? No, Luke said again. Louder. Hames can't. And the banker here is Mr. Pendleton. He won't listen to you. Why not? Because, Luke said, his voice tight. His wife, Mrs. Pendleton, is Martha Davies' sister, the preacher's wife. She despises you. She thinks you are what they all think. He looked at his hands. She'll tear you apart. I won't let you go. It was the first time he had ever tried to command her. It was not a request. Clara went to the peg and took down her thin coat. She looked at him, her eyes steady. I came here for a roof. Luke, I'm not going to lose it sitting by a fire. You went to town and you fixed one problem. Now I will go and fix this one. Clara, you don't... She walked past him, out the door. He shouted her name. Once. She did not stop. She hitched the mule to the buckboard, her hands shaking, but her resolve firm. She would not be helpless. Not again. Luke watched her go, his face a mask of fury and fear. He let her get a mile down the muddy, half-frozen track. Then he saddled his horse and followed, staying far enough back that she would not see him. Grit Creek was a sea of mud. Clara pulled the buckboard up to the small building marked Grit Creek Bank Loan. She took a deep breath and walked inside. Mr. Pendleton was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked surprised to see her. Mrs. Sterling. What a surprise. Mr. Pendleton, I'm here about my husband's loan. Before he could answer, a voice came from the back room. Is that her? Is that the Hollowell woman? A large woman, dressed in dark, expensive silk, emerged. Her face was powdered, but it could not hide the pinched, sour line of her mouth. This was Mrs. Pendleton. Well, the woman said, looking Clara up and down. So it is true? My sister Martha said Luke Sterling had lost his mind. Ma'am, I am here to speak to your husband. My husband is a busy man. He doesn't have time for charity cases. Mrs. Pendleton smiled. A thin, cruel expression. Tell me, dear, how did you do it? How did you convince that broken creature to marry you? He may be scarred, but I never took him for a fool. This is a private matter, Clara said, her voice trembling, her face heating. Oh, I think not, Mrs. Pendleton said, stepping closer. The whole street could hear her. Everyone in this town knows what you are. You came here with a gambler and drove him to his grave, and now you've sunk your claws into the first poor soul who'd have you. She lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper that carried to the street. That charity marriage fooled no one. Dear, we all know what a desperate woman will do for a roof, and we all know what a lonely man will pay for. Clara stood frozen, the public humiliation washing over her. She was back where she started. She was nothing. That's enough, a low voice said from the doorway. Luke stood there. He was not looking at Mrs. Pendleton. He was looking at her husband, who was cowering behind his desk. Luke's face was calm. It was a terrifying, absolute calm. My wife, Luke said, his voice very soft, came to talk business. Now, see here, Sterling. Mr. Pendleton squeaked. My wife was just... Your wife, Luke said, taking a step inside, spoke out of turn. You can't... Pendleton started. Luke moved. It was fast, like the punch he'd thrown at Barrows, but this time it was not a punch. He grabbed the front of Mr. Pendleton's starched shirt, yanking him halfway over the desk. Papers scattered. You will give me an extension, Luke snarled, his face inches from the banker's. I will not. Assault! Sheriff! Pendleton shrieked. Luke's other hand, his bandaged one, drew back. Luke, no! Clara screamed. The sheriff's door was next to the bank. Sheriff Miller was a heavy man, and he was already there, his gun drawn. Let him go, Sterling, the sheriff said, his voice tired. Luke froze. He looked at the banker, then at the sheriff, then at Clara. He let go. Mr. Pendleton fell back into his chair, gasping. "You're under arrest, Luke," the sheriff said. "Assault." Luke didn't resist. He put his hands out, and the sheriff cuffed them. They walked him out of the bank, past his horse, and into the small stone jail. The iron door clanged shut. Clara stood in the bank, shaking. "Mrs." Pendleton was smiling. "Well, it seems your husband is just as low-bred as you are. You'll lose the ranch, and he'll rot in a cell." Clara walked out. She stood in the muddy street. She looked at the bank. She looked at the jail. She walked into the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Miller," she said. The sheriff looked up. He was sitting at his desk, filling out paperwork. Luke was in the cell behind him, standing, gripping the bars. He was watching her, his face grim. "He can't let you see him, ma'am." "I don't want to see him," Clara said, her voice clear. "I'm here to post his bail." The sheriff sighed. "Mrs. Sterling, I heard the commotion. Mr. Pendleton is aggrieved. Bail is high. $100. "I don't have $100, Clara said. "Then I can't let him go." "I have the ranch," she said. The sheriff stopped writing. Luke grabbed the bars, his knuckles white. "Clara, no." "The deed, the tattered S," Clara said. Her eyes locked on the sheriff. "My name is on it. It's half mine. It's worth more than the loan, and it's worth more than the bail. I'll sign it over to you. As surety, let him go." "Clara, don't you dare." Luke growled from the cell. "That's everything. That's your roof." Clara turned. She walked to the cell, standing just out of his reach. The street, the whispers. Mrs. Pendleton. None of it mattered. Only the man behind the bars. She looked him in the eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "I'd rather have you than land," she said softly. Sheriff Miller looked at the deed in Clara's hand, then at Luke gripping the bars, then back at Clara. The whole of Grit Creek's main street seemed to be holding its breath, listening. He saw the ashes of the Pendletons' reputation smoldering, and he saw the stubborn, unyielding set of Clara's jaw. He was a man who understood leverage. He also understood that Mrs. Pendleton's cruelty had just pushed these two people past their limit. "Mr. Pendleton," the sheriff called, not turning his head. "I've got the deed to the tattered S here, as surety for your troubles. Or you can let this go, seeing as no real harm was done to your person." From the bank, a high, reedy voice shouted, "I will not be." "The fire last night, Mr. Pendleton," the sheriff said, his voice dropping low. "The one down in the hollow? Folks are saying the talk that started it came from your parlor. Folks are saying a man in your position shouldn't be encouraging vigilantes." There was a choked silence. Then, "Let him go." Sheriff Miller nodded once. He unlocked the cell. The iron door swung open with a heavy groan. Luke stepped out, rubbing his wrists. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at Clara. He was breathing hard, his face a mask of shame and a raw, new emotion she could not name. He had been ready to fight the world for his ranch. She had just offered to give it away for him. They walked out of the jail, into the muddy street. The silence of the ride home was a living thing, thick and heavy as the wet air. Clara could feel the eyes of the town on her back. The whispers had changed. She was no longer just the gambler's unlucky widow. She was the fool. A fool who had tied herself to a violent, scarred man. A woman who would defend a man who assaulted a banker in broad daylight. They were a pair now, matched in their ruin. They reached the ranch as the weak sun was setting, turning the muddy puddles into pools of rust. The cabin looked small, the broken corral a skeleton in the gloom. Clara unhitched the mule, her movement stiff. Luke stood by the wagon, not moving. He was watching the cabin, the half-finished roof, the place where his brother had died. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough, torn. She stopped, her back to him, her hand on the mule's harness. "You should go," he said. She closed her eyes. The cold air stung her cheeks. "Luke," We are tired. Let's not—" "No." He moved, coming to stand a few feet from her. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ground, at the mud that sucked at his boots. "I mean it. You go. You take the mule. You take what's left. Go to Santa Fe. Go back east. Go anywhere but here." She turned, slowly. His face was a landscape of despair. "You heard them," he said, his voice flat. "They're right. I'm like this land. I'm cursed. I bring bad luck. I bring violence." He gestured, a broken movement, to his own face, his own hands. "My ma, Amos, Sarah, and now, you. I almost got you shamed. I almost lost your roof. I am a haunted man. Clara, I've got nothing left in me but fire and bad memories." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow. "You deserve better. You deserve peonies. You deserve a teacher's desk. You deserve a whole man, not this, not what's left. I'm releasing you. The bargain is done. You saved me. Now save yourself." He had said it. He had offered her an escape. He was pushing her away with all the strength his guilt could muster, believing it was the only kindness he had left to give. Clara looked at him for a long time. She saw the man who had pulled Mort Barrows off her. She saw the man who had covered her with his coat. She saw the man who had confessed his sins by a frozen river. And she saw the man who had just offered to let her go, sacrificing his one small piece of warmth for her safety. She stepped closer. She reached out, not to his face, but to his shirt, her fingers closing on the rough wool over his heart. "I didn't marry your name. Luke," she said, her voice quiet, but so clear it cut through the dusk. "I didn't marry this land, and I didn't marry your brother's memory." He stared at her, confused, his breath catching. "I married what's left of your soul," she whispered, "and I'm not leaving it." He recoiled, as if she had struck him. He had no answer for that. He had built his walls to keep out judgment, to keep out pity. He had no defense against acceptance. He just stared at her, his mouth half open, while the first cold stars of evening pricked the sky above them. The future was a gray, shrinking line. The bank loan was still due. The extension Pendleton had been forced to give them was only 30 days. They began to sell what was left. Luke rode to a rancher 2 valleys over, a man who did not listen to Grit Creek gossip. He sold the 2 geldings. He got half what they were worth. They were thin from the long winter. He came back with coin, his face grim. The money went into a tin box on the mantel. It was not enough. A week later, they sold the mule. It felt like selling a part of the family. Clara stroked its nose as the rancher led it away. Now they had no way to get to town. They sold the last of the scrawny cattle Luke had rounded up, the ones the renegades had missed. The tin box grew heavier, but it was still too light. They were grounded. They were isolated. The future looked bleak, a slow starvation of money and hope. They were down to the bone, with nothing left to sell but the land itself, which was the one thing they could not let go. They lived on beans and water. The laughter that had briefly sparked between them was gone. The nights were quiet, but they slept in the fur bed together every night, a silent, stubborn acknowledgement that they were in this, all of it, until the end. The end came on a dry, windy night. They were asleep when the smell woke Luke. It was not the sweet smell of juniper. It was acrid, oily. Kerosene. He was out of the bed in one motion. "Clara, wake up! Get your boots on! Now!" He wrenched the cabin door open. The night was not dark. It was a hellish, dancing orange. The barn was an inferno. Flames licked 50 feet into the air. Sparks carried on the wind like swarms of angry hornets. And there were men, 3 of them, on horseback, their faces hidden by scarves. They were sitting their horses just beyond the heat, watching it burn. One of them saw Luke. He raised a bottle. "We're cleansing the sin from this valley. Sterling!" he shouted, his voice high and drunken. "You and your fallen woman." He threw the bottle. It shattered against the cabin wall, near the wood pile. Kerosene splashed. The woodpile ignited with a whoosh. "No!" Luke roared. Clara ran out, her dress half-buttoned, carrying the water bucket. It was a useless, pathetic gesture against the wall of flame. "Get back in the house! Clara!" Luke yelled, grabbing the axe. He ran to the woodpile, trying to scatter the burning logs before they caught the cabin roof. One of the riders spurred his horse. Throwing a second torch, it sailed over Luke's head, over the cabin, and landed on the dry, shingled roof of the barn's small tack room, the only part not yet fully ablaze. "The horses!" Clara screamed. Luke had forgotten. In his panic for the cabin, he had forgotten the new mare and the old plow horse he had bought with the last of their money. They were in the tack room. Luke dropped the axe. "Stay here! Luke, no! It's too late!" He didn't listen. He ran, covering his face with his arm, and plunged through the low doorway of the tack room, disappearing into the smoke. Clara screamed his name. The men on horseback laughed. They wheeled their horses and galloped away, their cleansing done. Clara was alone, caught between the burning woodpile and the roaring barn. She heard a terrified whinny. A moment later, Luke burst from the smoke, slapping the rump of the screaming mare. He was coughing, his hair singed. Go!" he yelled, driving the horse away. He turned back. "The gelding, he's trapped. Pin!" He dove back inside. "Luke!" Clara grabbed her water bucket and ran toward the tack room. She had to help. She reached the doorway just as Luke emerged, pulling the old gelding by its halter. The horse's mane was on fire. "It's going!" Luke yelled. "The roof!" As he spoke, the main beam of the barn, burnt through, gave way. It collapsed with a sound like a cannon, sending a billion sparks into the air. The concussion threw Clara forward, into the tack room, just as the gelding, in its terror, bolted past her. Luke was outside. She was inside, and the small doorway she had come through was suddenly blocked by a shower of burning timber. She was trapped. Smoke instantly filled the small space. It was thick, black, and hot. She couldn't breathe. She dropped to her knees, covering her mouth, but the heat was unbearable. It was cooking her. "Luke!" she screamed, her voice a raw tear. "Clara!" His voice was a roar of pure, primal terror. She heard a sound outside, a heavy, repeated thud. He was on the outside wall. He was kicking it. "Stand back!" he bellowed. She crawled away, pressing herself against the far wall. The wood was hot against her back. A boot burst through the planks. Then again, he was breaking the wall apart with his feet. A third kick, and a hole large enough to crawl through appeared. He was there, a dark shape against a wall of fire, his hand reaching. "Now, give me your hand." She grabbed him. He pulled, his grip like iron. He yanked her through the splintered wood, tumbling out onto the muddy, spark-lit ground. Just as the tack room roof caved in, they lay gasping, their lungs burning. They were alive. They were out. Clara got to her knees. "Luke, you—" Then she screamed. The hem of her nightdress was on fire. A spark had caught, and the dry cotton was igniting, flames crawling up her leg. She scrambled, trying to beat it out. Luke did not hesitate. He lunged, tackling her, shoving her face down into the cold, wet mud near the water trough. He fell on top of her, his hands, his bare hands, grabbing the burning fabric. He smothered the flames against the wet ground, against her skin. Clara heard a sound, a sharp, wet sizzle. She smelled it, the smell of burnt hair, burnt cotton, and burnt skin. His skin. The fire was out. He collapsed beside her, his body shaking, breathing in raw, ragged sobs. He was cradling his hands to his chest. Clara rolled over, her legs stinging, the mud cold. "Luke, your hands!" In the terrible, flickering light of the burning barn, she saw them. They were gone, the skin on his palms, on his fingers. It was a red, weeping, blackened ruin. He had saved her. He had put out the fire with his own flesh. She scrambled to her feet, pulling him up. He was weak, in shock. He leaned on her, a dead weight, and she half dragged, half carried him to the cabin. The woodpile fire was dying, having failed to catch the damp logs of the house. She got him inside, into the light. He sank onto the stool, shivering, his eyes wide with pain. I, he whispered, looking at his hands. He couldn't speak. Shh, Clara said. Her own fear was gone, replaced by a cold, fierce calm. Don't talk. She went to her trunk. She pulled out the last of the clean linens. She got the carbolic acid. She got the small tin of lard she used for cooking. She sat in front of him. Give them to me. He shook his head, pulling his hands back. Don't waste it, Clara. Just give them to me, Luke. He slowly, agonizingly, held them out. They were trembling violently. She poured the water, her own hands shaking. She began to clean them. It was the worst thing she had ever done. He did not scream. He just whimpered, a low animal sound, his body rigid, sweat pouring down his face. She worked for an hour, cleaning away the ash, the dirt, the burnt cloth. When she was done, she coated his raw flesh in the lard and wrapped both hands in thick, white bandages, turning them into useless, white clubs. He was pale as death, his body sagging with shock. She helped him to the fur bed and laid him down, pulling the blankets over him. He looked up at her, his eyes swimming with pain and fever. You should have let me burn, he whispered, his voice cracking. Don't, Clara said, her throat tight. It's my fault, all of it, the fire, the curse. I told you. He was weeping, silent tears tracking through the soot on his face. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your care. Clara looked at the man in her bed, the man who had faced fire, who had broken through a wall, who had sacrificed his hands for her. She sat on the edge of the bed. She leaned down. She gently, softly, kissed the puckered white scar on his cheek. Then she kissed the old, healed lash marks on his shoulder, visible through the tear in his singed shirt. They took the barn, she whispered, her lips against his skin. They took the horses. They can take the land, but this, they can't sell. Love is the only thing left they can't sell. Luke, and we have that. He closed his eyes, his body finally surrendering to the pain, and slept. Clara sat by the bed all night, watching him, the smell of smoke thick in the cabin, the ruins of their life glowing red outside the window. Dawn came, gray and cold. Clara was dozing in the chair when the sound of a horse made her jump. She went to the door, her heart leaping into her throat. Had they come back? It was Sheriff Miller. He was alone. He looked exhausted. He reined in, his eyes taking in the smoldering black pit where the barn had been. He saw the tracks. He saw the broken cabin wall. He dismounted, walking slowly to the porch. Mrs. Sterling, Sheriff, Luke, he's alive. He's burned. His hands. The sheriff took his hat off. He looked genuinely ashamed. I think I know who did this. The talk. It got out of hand. Mrs. Pendleton's righteous fury. He spat. I will handle them. He reached into his coat. I was coming here anyway. I gave Mr. Pendleton a choice. He drops the charges, or I start asking his wife's friends about an attempted murder. He handed her the deed. It's yours, free and clear. Clara took it, her hand numb. And this, he said, pulling out a sealed envelope. This came yesterday, from the territorial marshal in Santa Fe. Clara looked at it. It was addressed to Luke. I'll open it. His hands. She broke the seal. Inside was a bank draft, a piece of paper. She looked at the name, and then at the amount. Her eyes went wide. She did not understand. It's a reward, ma'am, the sheriff said, his voice quiet. Information Luke gave a marshal, must be 5 years back, about a cattle thieving ring that killed his brother. Luke's testimony. It just hung the last of them down in Texas. He had this coming for a long time. Clara stared at the numbers. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to pay the bank. It was enough to buy lumber. It was enough to buy horses. It was enough. She went back inside, the draft in her hand. Luke was awake, his eyes cloudy with fever. "The sheriff," he rasped. "He was here," Clara said, her voice shaking. She sat on the bed. Luke, he brought this." She held it up. He squinted at it, not understanding. "It's a reward. From Amos. For Amos," she said, her own tears starting to fall. It's enough. Luke, we can pay the bank. We're free." Luke stared at the paper. He looked at his white, bandaged hands, useless at his sides. He looked at the soot stain on the wall, and then at Clara. He was stunned. He was free, but the ranch was scarred. The barn was gone. His hands were ruined. He had nothing left to build with. He let his head fall forward, resting his forehead against her shoulder. A gesture of complete, broken surrender. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him. They had lost everything, and they had just been given it all back. They had each other. The first week was a blur of fever and pain. Luke's hands, swathed in thick, white bandages, were useless clubs. He was a man built of action, a man whose entire worth was tied to the work he could do, and he was rendered as helpless as a baby. Clara became his hands. This new intimacy was deeper, sharper, and more agonizing than the night they had shared. She had to feed him, spooning broth and beans into his mouth. He tried to refuse, his face dark with shame, but his body was weak with fever. "You must eat, Luke," she would say, her voice low and steady, ignoring his muttered curses. She had to help him with his coat, with his boots. She tended the fire. She tended the livestock, the 2 horses that had survived, the mare and the gelding, who stood nervously in the half-finished, makeshift pen she'd built from salvaged, unburnt logs. The worst was the dressings. Twice a day, she had to unwrap the bandages. The smell of lard and carbolic acid filled the small cabin. The new skin was a raw, weeping pink, exquisitely tender. He would sit on the stool, his body rigid, sweat beading on his forehead, his breathing a harsh, controlled hiss. He never cried out, but she could see the torment in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she would whisper, her own hands trembling as she gently cleaned the wounds. "I'm sorry." "It is not your fault," he grated out one night, his eyes squeezed shut. "It was my choice. It was my dress," she said, her voice catching. He opened his eyes. The fever had broken, and his gaze was clear, though shadowed with pain. "It was my life. Clara, you were the life. The barn was just wood." He was too weak to retreat, too weak to build his walls. He had no choice but to let her see him, to let her care for him. And in his weakness, he laid down his final, heaviest burden, his pride. He let her in. Spring came, as the outline had promised, but it came late. It came reluctantly. The mud from the thaw was ankle deep, a cold, thick mire, but in the black, rectangular scar where the barn had stood, a miracle occurred. Amidst the charcoal and ash, tiny, impossible pinpricks of green appeared, new grass. It was a sign. Life always returned. As the grass grew, so did the strength in Luke's hands. The bandages came off, revealing skin that was shiny, puckered, and terribly new. He started to work, his movements clumsy. He would try to lift the water bucket and wince, his grip failing. He sat on the porch for hours, just opening and closing his hands, stretching the stiff, scarred skin, his face a mask of frustration. Clara would sit beside him, not speaking, and mend the linens, her presence a silent encouragement. With the reward money clutched in her hand, a testament to Amos's memory, Clara rode the mare into Grit Creek. She did not know what to expect. She was the fool who stood by the violent man. She was the wife of the man who had assaulted the banker. She tied the mare outside the bank. She did not look at the jail. She walked inside. Mr. Pendleton was at his desk. When he saw her, he stood up, his face pale. Clara did not speak. She walked to his desk and laid the bank draft down. It was for the full amount. Then she laid down the coin for the interest. Pendleton looked at the draft, then at her. He could not meet her eyes. He stamped the loan, paid in full with a shaking hand, and pushed the deed back to her. "Mrs. Sterling," he mumbled. My wife," she spoke out of turn. The fire. We did not—" "You did not stop it," Clara said, her voice not loud, but cold and clear. She took the deed. She did not say thank you. She turned and walked out, her back straight. She went to the mercantile. Mr. Hames saw her coming. He was not busy, but he suddenly began stacking tins. "Mr. Hames, I need lumber, shingles, nails, glass for 2 windows, and—" She looked at her list. "Paint, white and blue." He stopped stacking. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face. He looked at the deed in her hand. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name with kindness. "Mrs. Sterling, the lumber. It will take a week to get here from Santa Fe." He cleared his throat. "Your credit is good." She stared at him. "I can pay. I have the reward." "I know," he said. "But your credit is good anyway. You tell Luke. You tell him I'll send the boys with the first wagon. No charge for the hauling." The town was softening. The brutality of the fire, the sight of Luke's ruined hands, it had shamed them. It had broken through their hard, righteous shell. That weekend, a wagon arrived. It was not just Mr. Hames's boys. It was Sheriff Miller and 2 ranchers from the South Valley. They brought lumber. They brought tools. Luke met them on the porch. His hands were raw, the new skin red, but he held them unbandaged. At his sides, he did not hide them. "Sheriff," he said, his voice stiff. "Sterling." The sheriff looked at the burned-out patch of ground. We come to help raise the barn." Luke's jaw tightened. His first instinct, the instinct of a lifetime, was to refuse, to snarl, to tell them to get off his land. He had never taken charity. He felt Clara's hand on his back, a small, warm pressure. "We need the barn. Luke," she whispered. He looked at the men. They were not smiling. They looked ashamed. They were here to make amends, in the only way men of the West knew how, with their labor. He looked at his own scarred, weak hands. He could not do it alone. He gave a single, sharp nod. "The foundation is there." They worked for 2 days. Luke worked with them, his hands bleeding by noon on the first day. Clara stopped him, took him inside, and rebandaged them, her face firm. "You'll direct," she said. "That is the work now." He hated it, but he did it. He stood, his hands wrapped and pointed, his voice sharp. "That beam is not square. Set it again." And they listened. They worked under his direction. Clara brought them water, and then coffee, and then a pot of beans. They ate together, sitting on the new sawn pine, the smell of fresh wood replacing the smell of ash. Mrs. Weaver arrived on the second day. She did not come with warnings of curses. She came with a crate of 6 squawking chickens and 2 small, bare-root apple trees. "A place ain't a home without eggs," she grunted, shoving the crate at Clara. "And these, put 'em by the south wall. They might live. They might not. Land's hard. But you look like you are, too. You'll do." It was the highest praise she had ever given. When they left, a new, strong, unpainted barn stood where the old one had been. And the cabin roof was finished. The men had shingled it, and Luke, with his bandaged hands, had shown them how to set the 2 new glass windows. That night, for the first time, light from inside the cabin shone out onto the land. The partnership settled into a new rhythm. It was quiet. It was strong. They no longer had to talk to fill the silence. The silence was comfortable. It was the sound of 2 people existing in the same space, in total accord. He would mend the fences, his hands slowly toughening, the scars fading from pink to a pale, silvery white. She would tend her new chickens and the small garden she had tilled near the house. She planted the apple trees, watering them with a devotion that was almost a prayer. They were a unit. When she struggled with a heavy feed sack, his hand would be there, under hers, to help her lift, when he sat at night, flexing his stiff fingers. She would bring him the tin of salve without his asking. They lived this way through the summer. The land healed, the ranch healed. One evening in late September, the air was crisp, holding the first promise of winter. But it was a promise, not a threat. They were prepared. The barn was full of hay. The cabin was chinked and sealed, the windows bright. Clara was coming back from the creek, her hands smelling of soap. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange across the mesas. She saw Luke sitting on the porch, in the fading light. He was carving. His hands, she noted, moved with their old certainty. The clumsiness was gone. The scars remained, a white web across his palms and knuckles, but they were his hands again. She walked up quietly. He was working on a thick, smooth plank of pine. He was carving letters. Tattered S Ranch. He had finished the main words. He was now, slowly, carving his own name at the bottom. L. Sterling, prop. She smiled, leaning against the post. It's beautiful, Luke. He did not look up, but his hands paused. It needs to be official. It's a new start. He finished the G and set the knife down. He picked up a smaller brush and a can of black paint. He painted the letters, his hand steady. Then he looked at her. The last light of the sun caught his face, illuminating the scar on his cheek. But his eyes were clear, and they were warm. He held out a different brush to her, a small, fine one, and he held out the pot of blue paint she had bought. It's not finished, he said. What? It's not just my ranch. Clara, it hasn't been for a long time. He pointed to the empty space just beneath his name. You need to paint yours. So it's legal. So it's right. Clara took the brush. Her heart was doing a strange, slow turn in her chest. She looked at him, at his serious, steady gaze. A small, teasing smile touched her lips. She had to ask. She had to hear it. Just a husband in name. Right? She whispered, the old words hanging between them. Luke looked up. The shadows were deep now, but she could see the faint smile that touched his own mouth, the one that pulled at his scar. He reached out, his scarred hand tracing her jawline, a touch that was now as familiar as her own skin. Not anymore, he said. His voice was low, and it held the weight of all the seasons they had passed. Not for a long time. Her hand was shaking, but she knelt. She dipped the brush in the blue paint, and in careful, clear letters, right below his, she wrote, C. Sterling. They stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Their names, side by side, bound in paint and wood. Luke put his hands on her shoulders. He did not say anything. He just turned her to face him. He held out his scarred hand, palm up, just as he had done that night in the storm. She put her hand in his. He drew her close, his other arm sliding around her waist. He began to move, a slow, swaying step, right there on the new porch. Luke, she whispered, laughing a little. There's no music. Yes, there is, he murmured, his face buried in her hair. Listen. She closed her eyes and listened. There was no fiddle. There was no piano. There was just the sound of the high desert wind whistling softly through the eaves of the new barn, the smell of fresh pine, and the damp earth of her garden, and, far off, beyond the ridges, the low, deep rumble of distant thunder. They danced. They swayed slowly in the fading light. Two quiet shadows, holding on, finally at peace. Months passed. Winter came again, but this time it was not an enemy. It was a time of rest. The cabin was warm, the windows bright, the pantry full. They sat by the fire. Luke reading to her from a book, Mr. Hames had ordered, his voice low and steady. She would listen, mending his shirts. The quiet industry a kind of love. One afternoon, while he was out checking his trap lines, Clara was putting away a clean blanket. She opened the small wooden box on the high shelf, the one where he had kept the locket. It was still there. She had not seen it since that night by the river. She felt no jealousy, no fear. She was just curious. She picked it up. It felt cold. She opened the small, silver clasp. It was empty. The small, intricate lock of blonde hair was gone. Clara closed the locket, a slow, secret smile spreading across her face. He had not thrown it in the river. He had not burned it. He had just let it go. He had emptied it of its power, of its guilt. He had kept the memory of his friend, perhaps, but he had released the ghost. He had made room. She put the locket back, closed the box, and never mentioned it. When the last snows melted, and the land was green again, Luke saddled their 2 new horses. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, surprised. "Just a ride," he said. He led her up the high canyon path, the one he had followed to track Barrows. But they went past that. They climbed until the ranch was just a small, neat square below them, the cabin and the new barn sitting strong in the valley. They stopped on the ridge. The wind was high here, clean and cold. The river, swollen with meltwater, rushed below, a ribbon of silver. This was the place. This was where his brother had been shot. This was where Sarah had walked into the water. This was where he had, in his deepest despair, confessed everything to Clara. It was a place of ghosts. They sat on their horses, looking down. Clara looked out, not at the ranch, but east, toward Grit Creek, a place she could not even see, but had always felt. "I don't hear them anymore," she said, her voice quiet, carried on the wind. Luke looked at her. "Hear what?" "The whispers," she said. "The women in the mercantile, Mrs. Davies, all of them. They're just gone. I don't care what they say." Luke nodded. He looked down at the valley. He saw the finished cabin roof, the strong line of the new barn. He saw the 2 apple trees, tiny sticks with the first, faint buds of green. He saw the smoke rising from his chimney. "It feels like home," he said. The words were simple, but they were the truest thing he had ever spoken. The land was not a curse. It was not a testament to his failure. It was just land. It was their land. He reached over, across the space between their horses. He offered his scarred, calloused hand. Clara took it. Their fingers laced together. 2 broken hearts, 2 scarred hands. Finally, completely, whole. They sat, hand in hand, and watched the sun set behind the vast, untamed ridges of the West. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.